Hello, hello, and welcome to this week's edition of the Logos Project with me, Dom Dalmaso, theology and philosophy major and content creator. This show aims at taking you back in time to understand prominent thinkers, writers, and cultures. We are semi-educated amateurs here at the Logos Project who constantly strive to deepen our knowledge of the history of human thinking. You're listening to the Logos Project with Dom Dalmaso, and in today's episode, we are joined by my friend Joe Mohler. Joe, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing okay.
Awesome. So in this podcast, we like to focus on the history of thought, or as we like to put it here, the human conversation. But today, I want to go from the macroscopic to the microscopic and focus on Joe's intellectual journey specifically. I found it really interesting. And I think the human race journeys through this human conversation, as we call it here, but so do individual humans, right? And your story, Joe, really fascinated me. Yeah, I thought it was really relevant to our day and age. So I'll just kick it off with a question, if you don't mind. It's basically, tell us about your background. Like, how did you grow up?
Well, I think I grew up the way a lot of people, in America do, especially Christians. I was politically conservative. I grew up in a non-denom church in South Central Pennsylvania. It's in the county of Lancaster, so there's quite a bit of Pennsylvania Dutch there. And actually, people who live there would say it's southeast, by the way. But yeah, there's quite a bit of Pennsylvania Dutch, Mennonite, Amish country, and the church that I grew up in was a former Mennonite church that then became non-denom, and that would have been probably about 25 years ago.
Gotcha. Interesting. So what was that like? What was the atmosphere? What did you believe in general?
Actually, I got to correct another fact because it didn't become a Mennonite church 25 years ago. It was formerly Mennonite about 50 years ago. So basically, the way the church was structured, again, it was what we believed, very typical of any type of evangelical church that, it fit the stereotype, if you will. If you go to a conservative university like a Bob Jones or a Liberty or a college just near in Lancaster called Lancaster Bible College, those are the sorts of beliefs that we have, that we share. They're Baptist, mostly conservative Mennonite. A lot of it, you might find some strains of Arminianism, but also a fair amount of Calvinism. Specifically, go ahead.
What are some specific doctrines, for example?
Yeah, so believers' baptism, symbolic communion, no speaking in tongues, spiritual gifts are pretty much, they faded away, they cease, so they're cessationalists, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. And what about, this is bound to come up, what about young earth creationism?
Yeah, no, that's another doctrine that they press pretty strongly when the topic arises. To be fair, I certainly don't hold those positions anymore. But right. The idea that they're constantly like dogmatically pounding the table every Sunday that the earth was created 6,000 years ago, that's not true. It's just that when the subject is brought up, they're pretty dogmatic that that's how you have to read the Bible.
That makes sense, yeah. And I guess that's a good segue into what did they think about the Bible? No, I don't want to say they, as the ominous others, but in general, the atmosphere, when it comes to biblical interpretation, what was it like?
I would say there's a lot of ways to approach the Bible, and I'm sure we could have a long conversation about that.
Yeah.
But, Origen, notoriously came up with 4 methods of understanding the scriptures, which was, obviously you have the literal, then you have the moral, the Christological, and the anagogical. One of the things that you really find in a more of a fundamentalist, non-denom Christian setting is a heavy emphasis on the literal interpretation of the Bible. And it's much more so that way than what you'd find, say, in the Catholic Church. So I'll give you a good example. If you look at the Exodus obviously in the book of Exodus and the account of how 2 million people left Egypt. If you ask a Catholic and you really press them on whether or not they believe 2 million people left Egypt in the account in the book of Exodus, I'm not exactly sure what they'll tell you. I would assume most would say they probably believe something like that. But the emphasis on that story is not on the literal historical event. It's much more on the moral, on the Christological, and especially the anagogical, and how that manifests into the end times for the Catholic. Whereas what I find consistently occurring is this heavy emphasis on, let's do some archaeology. Were there any chariot wheels found in the bottom of the Red Sea? That emphasis is so much stronger in the evangelical church than it is, but especially in the more fundamentalist camp.
So my next question is, when did you first begin to doubt? Like, what led up to that?
Yeah, that's a long story. So
take your time. We have all evening.
So the way I grew up, I look back and there are so many possibilities when it comes to how you can grow up. And I must say, of all the possible ways I could have been brought up, I was brought up pretty good. I was very fortunate with the family that I had, with the church that I went to, the community that was there, the elders that were there. And so I had a very loving culture that surrounded me and encouraged me and wanted me to do the right thing and was constantly, giving me advice and putting me in the right direction. That's what I want to say first off. When I got older, I really began to have an interest in theology. I mean, this was in middle school, but really in high school, I got this immense interest in theology. And if you grow up in, an evangelical setting, especially, again, in the more fundamentalist camp, it seems like the direction, this is what I found with my friends that I formed inside and outside of the church I went to, was the direction that you had to take was really studying Reformation theology, which was heavily Calvinist. And that's really what I thought. That was my whole system of theology, and I was just heavily invested in that all through high school. When I got into college, my interest in theology really began to decrease. Throughout my first semester in college, I had a fair degree of interest in theology. After that, it fell off a cliff. And I think the reason for that is that the Calvinist system is pretty basic. You have the famous TULIP, which is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And basically, it runs like, if you're totally depraved, then God must unconditionally elect you. When he comes to die and to save you in his limited atonement, he will irresistibly call you. And because of that unconditional election, you will persevere to the end. That's Calvinism. That's the whole Calvinist doctrine. And so when you have that sort of a system, and then you get into some of the extensions about how God receives glory, well, he has different attributes. It's a pretty easy system to grasp. And so theology became boring. And so I began looking for other things that would interest me, that would perk my interest. And I've always been kind of a little bit of a rebel. And so really the first summer of college, I began listening to some atheists, thinkers like Sam Harris, a little bit of Richard Dawkins, but not just atheists, but cultural critics, people who had opinions, but they were outside of the bubble that I was really exposed to in the past. And so Yuval Noah Harari, Chris Anderson, Steven Pinker, these were people that I was reading at intense volumes. I read probably 3 books by Steven Pinker, and anyone who's read him knows that they're all like over 500 pages. And when you're not used to that, and you're not used to reading people in the academic circle who don't hold to traditional Christian values, it really rocks you. And the problem was the theological structure that I had in place wasn't sufficient enough to answer the critiques that a lot of these academics were offering. And so it threw me into really a tailspin, and I didn't know what to do. It was slow, but over time I just began doubting more and more. So going into my sophomore year, I didn't realize how many questions I had, but it was beginning to really manifest in what my attitude towards going to church was, what my attitude towards holding small group. I became a small group leader that year. And especially by the 4th semester of my time in college, I really began doubting a lot of the stuff that I had traditionally held, because I was encountering things like evolution, learning about science, and asking questions like, okay, is it really that difficult to prove that the Earth is older than 10,000 years old? Not 3.8 billion years old, just older than 10,000 years old. That wasn't hard. When I realized how easy it was just by looking at climate cycles, ice layers, tree forests that were stacked on top of each other, that no, they weren't laid down by a flood. That, and then you learn about light travel and all of these different things.
Yeah.
It's like, for me, I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, so clearly the Bible's wrong. The Bible's wrong. What else is the Bible wrong about? And because I had that fundamentalist understanding of how to read the scriptures, and it really derailed my confidence in Christianity.
Yeah. I feel like this is a very, very common experience for many, especially young people in today's social political climate, but also the philosophy in the air, the contemporary way of thinking of things even if it's just quips, it comes from a very naturalistic, rationalistic way of viewing the world, right? And rationalism is something that came much later that started looking at the Bible in a very rigid sense, and fundamentalism kind of comes out of that. It's a reaction to this over-rationalization, you might say. And so there's like this double bind, this dichotomy, and young people are faced with it, and they don't know what to do at first. Like you said, it rocks their world, and it shakes the foundations that... Go ahead.
Well, they both start with the same premise. That's one of the things that people don't realize, is that they start with the exact same premise. So the reason that the young earth creationist movement was formed in response to Darwinism was because it understood that the physical evidence did say what it said, and that it didn't jive with a literal understanding of the Bible. And so therefore, the Bible had to be placed above science. That's right. The only way you really arrive at such a conclusion, where it's like, okay, so trigonometry, how long does it take for light to travel from here to here? Well, that can't be true, because the Bible says, well, no, only when you start with a position that the Bible is a historical text that seems to be incompatible with the historical record do you then start throwing knives at science.
And a lot of the roots of this kind of tension between science and biblical faith, you might say, they stem, at least as far as my understanding goes, from the Protestant Reformation, but there are roots in the Middle Ages as well. But you do see a clear split between reason, right, the philosophy of the Greeks, and Christianity from the Judeo-Christian scriptures. There's a split where they're deemed incompatible. Luther talked about this in The Depravity of the Will. Is that the one?
Oh, the bondage of the will.
Bondage of the will. Yeah. There definitely is a causal pattern in history for the development of this. You can't be both scientific and religious. It doesn't work that way. And here in this podcast, we like looking at the origins of such competing claims.
I love this topic. I mean, this is the super interesting topic to me, because Tertullian, when you look at Luther, the church, I love Bishop Barron. I'm sure we'll get into him sometime, but Bishop Barron, has said on numerous occasions on his podcast that the church has traditionally rejected Tertullian's position, which is, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
That's right.
Well, if you look at what Martin Luther, but then especially the people who objected to Darwin, it is exactly what Tertullian said. What does science have to do
with the Bible?
That has nothing to do with us. And it's like, man, like that's the whole problem. I'm hesitant to say that Luther and Calvin would have objected to Darwinism. I want to be fair to them.
Yeah.
But the problem is that when you abandon tradition, it just sets you up for making really, really, really bad mistakes. And
because you're starting from scratch,
It's exactly. And so, what happened when the church started from scratch? They had a Tertullian. They had somebody that made a bad mistake. And so the Protestant Reformation, it produced something that really reacted poorly to Darwin, because it's a relatively new phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. This dichotomy showed up again in the Middle Ages when the Arabs introduced the works of Aristotle, and there was the same kind of arguments. Basically, what does Aristotle have to do with Christianity? He's a pagan Greek philosopher, and he's dangerous. But Aquinas basically pulled the typical church father Catholic move, which is, no, let's look at what he has to say. Truth comes from one source, and it can be found in multiple places. And so he synthesizes the newly acquired availability of Aristotle's works with the Christian revelation, and he becomes a beacon of intellectual thought in Europe. But also, his philosophy builds upon this process that we like to talk about here at the Logos Project, this process of synthesis, of pruning, and also outright rejecting, where you look at what previous thinkers had to say, and you keep what's good, you change what's not so good, and you get rid of what's bad. And that's how the conversation moves forward. But in the Enlightenment, I would say it started with the Reformation, there's this rejection of tradition, but also this rejection of metaphysics and Descartes, right? Where epistemology becomes all that matters, right? How do I know that I exist? Well, I'm thinking. Okay, so I know I'm thinking, so that means I must exist. So instead of saying things exist, how do I come to know them? We say, oh, I'm knowing, so I exist. How do I come to know that other things exist? So it's beginning from universal doubt and setting metaphysics aside as if it was all a bunch of nonsense. Anything else before I jump into the next question?
What's the transition? Are we going to?
I think you're gonna like it. The
All right.
transition is very C.S. Lewis. When
Okay.
when did you first begin to doubt your doubts?
Oh man, it's interesting. I don't know if I've ever told anybody this, so of course I have to say it on my first podcast interview, right? Um, from the outset, when I was really beginning to question Christianity, and probably over the summer, over the second summer, so then going into my junior year, I really didn't like the implications of not being a Christian. You know, you might hear some people say, "Oh, I left, rejected all that nonsense." For me, that was a really tough call because I realized how much of a rejection that would be to my family, and it scared. I mean, it scared the hell out of me. If I'm just honest, I mean, it really did.
Yeah.
And I was always very cautious, and I was taking slow steps in my time of doubt, I guess, if you will. And so by the time I was in my beginning of my first semester of my junior year, that was probably when I was at the lowest, where there was probably a period of time there where I was not a believer, where I didn't believe in God at all. I didn't want to go to church at all. I had my sister down at college who was making me go, so because I was the one with the car. So, but I would say when I began to doubt my doubts was when I was able to break out of this idea that all Christianity was fundamentalism. All it was this fundamentalist evangelicalism. And that was because of my uncle who became an Eastern Orthodox. He grew up under my grandparents. He moved down to Tennessee. He became Anglican, and then he became Eastern Orthodox. And he really started to see some of the things that I had been talking about. I had posted a number of things online, and he had sent me a bunch of private messages just following up with me, asking me questions, probing me, and offering insights that oftentimes they didn't necessarily answer my question, but they made me appreciate the level of difficulty behind the question. One of the things you often hear is that the problem of evil isn't a new problem. It's something that the greatest religious minds have wrestled over. It's something that Nietzsche wrestled with, and it's something that Dostoevsky wrestled with. And to just dismiss it as if it's not a tough question is simply ridiculous. It's not like you can't just like throw free will at it and then say, "Oh, yeah, we're done." The problem is those are the types of answers I had been given.
Yeah.
Oh, free will. Oh, that makes it better. Meanwhile, we have, as Dostoevsky, said in the Brothers Karamazov, we have babies being tossed up in the air, caught on the end of the Turks' bayonets right in front of their mothers, from whose womb they cut open and ripped out the baby. Oh, free will. Give me a break. Why does God allow evil? It was reading passages like that where, and my uncle pointed me to Dostoevsky, and who was an Eastern Orthodox, who honestly was really the first non-evangelical I really encountered. Because at that point I was desperate. I was like, I don't have anywhere else to go. It's like either I pop out of this little circle or I become an atheist. And to me, when I looked at how long Christianity had been around and how dense its theology had become, I was like, I owe it to them. I owe it to Christianity to give it one more final shot.
Yeah.
And so that's when I began engaging with the Eastern Orthodox. That's when I began saying, well, I wonder what these Catholics have to say. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, Thomas Aquinas. Okay. When I began to doubt my doubts was when I began to realize the extent of the tradition. And I was like, I think these guys might have something to say that I haven't considered. And when I started giving them a shot, I found out that was very much the correct answer.
Gotcha. Last time we talked, you mentioned something about Jordan Peterson. Do you mind sharing that again? I thought it was interesting.
Oh, yeah. I actually had him written down here. I kind of skipped over him. I should not have skipped over him. That's just a disservice to Jordan Peterson. Anybody who thinks that the Bible is boring needs to listen to Jordan Peterson's lectures, because I began listening to Jordan Peterson. At that time, I had found the Bible boring. I was beginning to find the Bible boring. He didn't really quell any of my doubts because I was going into a season of doubt. But he had these lectures on Genesis, and they were so fascinating. He brought them to life, and there was one thing that he said that I never forgot. He said, if you think that these stories have lasted for as long as they've lasted because they're just these meaningless folk tales, you are a moron. And I just was like, huh, interesting. But to me, and this goes back to this fundamentalism, to me, the Garden of Eden was a historical event where a serpent was slithering around and got a woman to eat an apple. That to me was just as important as any moral meaning. And so I put way too much time into that aspect of the story, without actually trying to understand, okay, why was this story written in Babylon? Why is the serpent there? Well, the serpent is something that is revered in the Babylonian theology, if you will. And so what are they doing? They're critiquing Babylon. Why? What about the serpent? Those are the types of questions that you have to ask. And when you begin learning the answers and you begin really studying the story, you're like, I don't even really care about the historicity of it, honestly, because I don't think that that's really the purpose of the story.
Yeah. I just want to interject real quick. That's really interesting what you say, because that's what we're all about here on this podcast. And we have several episodes just on that topic where we talk about the Genesis story and what it actually means. Something else that we're going to look at, I haven't done this yet, is the historicity, you might say, of monogenism. So the fact that we come from a single couple, and how is that compatible with the obvious genetic fact that we are a polygenetic species? And are those things...
I have an answer for you.
Well, we'll have to do an episode on it together.
It starts with changing Augustine's understanding of original sin. Make it ontological, not chronological.
Ooh, interesting. That's definitely something we'll have to look at. Kenneth Kemp has a paper on this where he talks about the difference between the biological human and the philosophical human. And I was reading Robert Sokolowski. He's a phenomenologist. He was a Catholic priest too, who writes about language, not specifically. It's in his book called The Phenomenology of the Human Person. And he talks about how language presupposes an intersubjectivity that must begin with at least two individuals. That's just a tangent to whet our audience's appetite. But the reason why I think this is really interesting is because that's what we look at, is the history of these ideas. And the fact that you brought up Babylon, I love that, because that's what we're all about here. Now, I don't want to lose any audience members who think, they think that the Exodus never happened. We're not like complete spiritualists, you might say, where everything is allegorical. But I'll push it back at you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to what is the priority of the text.
That's right.
I saw a debate recently between a Catholic and a Protestant on the extra books, if you will.
Yeah.
And one of the points that the Protestant made was, well, there's historical errors in these extra books. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure you could, if you use that standard, which atheists do all the time to the regular canon that Protestants do accept, you could find some quote-unquote historical errors. And so I went and did a little experiment, and I said, okay, what are some historical errors in the Old Testament? So I Googled it.
Yeah.
And I came across the story of David and Goliath, where it says, David cut off Goliath's head and then brought the head back to Jerusalem, but David didn't conquer Jerusalem until he became king in 2 Samuel. So you read that and you're like, is that a problem? No, it's not a problem. The priority of the text is much deeper than getting the semantics at the surface correct. And that's, I feel like, the biggest error that people make, is that they try to turn the Bible into, honestly, a Quran of a sort.
That's right.
Where it's only holy in its original language. You want to know something? We don't have the Bible in the original Hebrew. We don't have the original
manuscripts.
We don't have the and so that's an impossible standard. And by the way, they don't have that for the Quran either. But side note. But when we approach the scriptures, we have to ask, what is the reason it's here? And I think that Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, has the perfect key, and it's that it's Christological in nature. The Old Testament, whether it's narrative, whether it's poetry, whether it's some type of an epic, prophecy, all of it has one unifying hermeneutic, Christ.
That's right. Yeah.
Read the Old Testament that way. Then you'll get it.
And also, you pointed out to me a few days ago that the Bible's a library. There are some historical books, and there are some poetic books, and there are some allegorical books. And it's important to understand the genre. It's also important to know the writing techniques of the time. If you factor all these things in, you do see a fascinating story with deep theological meaning that has historical basis. Now, when we say historical basis, we mean, the people of Israel and their struggle with God, right? And
Right.
like you said, it's very important to understand we're dealing with the library of a specific people.
Right.
And it culminates, like you said, in Christ. And that's how you read it. We could go for days. We'll have to do an episode just on this. I keep saying in my other episodes, oh, we'll do an episode on this, we'll do an episode on that, we'll do an episode on this. And I'm like, you know what?
You got 100 guarantees already.
Exactly. I'm setting myself up for failure here. Anyway, so I want to move things slightly forward. So,
Sure.
Why Catholicism?
Ooh. Well, I would say this. There are a couple of options that I would say to somebody who's, grown up evangelical fundamentalist or fundamentalist evangelical, however it's said. Become high Anglican, Eastern Orthodox, or Catholic. Those are your three options, because all of them have deep tradition. All of them place a huge emphasis on the intellectual side of the faith. Obviously, Orthodox also have a hyper emphasis on the mysticism of the faith, on the contemplative nature of the faith, which is, I think, essential. That being said, within those three, why become Catholic? Well, that was a tough question, because my uncle became Eastern Orthodox, and so he's like, saying, see, I told you, evangelicalism, not the best. They don't have sufficient answers. Yeah, I know, I became Eastern Orthodox. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And then I became a Catholic. And so why Rome over Constantinople, if you will? Well,
Yeah.
I would say it comes down to the Pope, the structure of the church. But really, I would say the number one influence, and this is a highly technical difference.
Yeah.
It's the theory of development. What you find in the Eastern tradition, in the Anglican tradition, is somewhat of a rejection of what John Henry Newman wrote when he wrote his essay on the development of Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
I can get into that a little bit if you want.
Sure.
Okay. Basically, Newman, when he was writing this, was an Anglican, and then as he realized what he was writing and the conclusions it was drawing, he then became a Catholic. So the development of Christian doctrine basically is the idea that ideas themselves aren't these stagnant things that just exist and then stay the same through every context. Like, ideas, they're organisms. They live. They move into different environments, and they adapt to those environments. If they don't, they die.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the very early church, especially the events surrounding the First Ecumenical Council, where you have Arianism everywhere, especially after even the First Ecumenical Council, what you find is there's a demand for answers to questions that haven't been answered before, and
or questions that haven't even been raised before.
Exactly. Yeah. And so when those questions are asked, like for instance, if St. Peter ran into, all of a sudden appeared and listened to one of Arius' sermons, he may have never thought of the things that Arius was saying because they just never came to his mind, because the idea existed up until Arius' time for, hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so it presents the potential for all sorts of theories that are crazy to come up and be formulated and challenge the church. And what happened in the First Council of Nicaea was it was a repudiation of Arianism. But what I think is a really important detail is that they repudiated it with a development. They used the word, the Son is consubstantial with the Father.
Yeah.
Well, you won't find that word anywhere in Scripture. They made it up at the council.
Yeah.
Right? That's a development. And so with John Henry Newman, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's interesting because I like Newman's analogy of the organism adapting to a different environment, because a different environment can bring out of that organism or that idea, as we're talking about, a different facet of its truth, right? It's essentially the same, but because of where it's at, we only see certain facets of it. And then you put it in a different environment, and suddenly you start seeing different facets. So it's like some kind of gem, right? Diamond.
Yeah.
There's all these different facets, and the light reflects on it in all these different ways. It's still the same thing, right? We're not saying doctrine changes, but doctrine develops, and we see this, and Newman does such a great job at showing this.
It's one of my favorite topics. I wrote an article about it called "The Nature of Ideas," And one of the picture I used was a picture of a ripple, where a stone had been dropped, and it splashes into the water. Now, it's a solid thing. If you break out like the elements of an idea, there's like the substance of it, and so it hits the water. That's the rock.
Yeah.
But the effects of it, the understanding of it, the application of it, that's the ripple, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this plane, like this pool, where people could be situated all around the pool. So in one part of the pool you have 1,200, and in another part of the pool you have 500, and then in another it's like our current day in America, and then maybe the one in 1,200 was in Italy. All these different cultures, different time periods, different locations of the pool, that by the time the idea, the ripple effect of the idea hits that person, it's going to have its own unique application.
That's right.
And because of that, because ideas naturally do that, there has to be a living voice of authority in order to mitigate the disaster of bad corruptions, of bad ripples, where somebody says, hey, this is a development, we're all great. Like, look at Arius. I mean, Arius says, he makes a pretty clever argument. He says, Christ is the most immaculate creation. Oh, that sounds familiar. That's who the Virgin Mary is. Mm-hmm. That's not who Jesus is.
Yeah.
We can give hyperdulia to Mary, right? Mm-hmm. But hyperdulia to Christ, that's not satisfactory.
No.
And so that's a development. It's Christ is very, uplifted, but it's a bad one. It's incorrect. But consubstantiality with the Father is also a development.
That's right.
It's a redefinition. It's a new definition, a new way of clarifying it to the people in that section of the pool, which is 325, Nicaea.
I love how Chesterton. Sorry to cut you off. I remember Chesterton saying that the Catholic Church is like this playpen. It was something like that. You got the fences, right? You could go all over the place. You can play in the sand. You can go down the slide. You can do whatever you want. Just don't cross the fence. Something like that.
Well, that's what people don't understand about the church. And I guess I better wrap up the Newman analogy because that's why it became Catholic. But
go ahead. Sorry about that.
But no, you're fine. So Newman would say that there's a playground, right? We have a playground here. We can have all sorts of games and thought experiments and all that stuff. And what was going on at the church before the First Council of Nicaea were these thought experiments. It just happened that one of them was really bad.
Yeah.
And so the church had to intervene. It was a referee. It pulled the flag. It said, nope, foul. That's the reason the church is there. It's to protect divine revelation and to elevate it when wrongful theology is presented, when it goes astray. And so the problem is that the Eastern Orthodox haven't had an ecumenical council in 1,300 years. They're constantly in schism with each other. There's not a whole lot of unity. There's certainly more unity in the Orthodox Church than any Protestant denomination, than what we see in Protestant denominations. But there is only one home to the kind of unity you find in Rome, which is under one pope. And because of that unity, we have the ability to safeguard truth against corruption. We have that mechanism in place. And one thing that's important to note, I'm not saying that there can't be corruption that the church doesn't address. That can certainly happen. Mm-hmm. But what we have ultimately is that if there is a heresy that exists in the church and it truly threatens the faith, we have a mechanism here and now to mitigate that disaster. And to me, the Catholic Church is the church that has the best response. It has the capability to do that, whereas the other churches out there really didn't seem to offer a satisfactory
it's almost purely
solution.
Practical. It's almost not even... It's just like I heard someone in a debate say something like, there's no unity in the Catholic Church. I mean, hey, first of all, us Protestants have left. We used to be
It's
Catholic.
a big playground.
Yeah. Right. So us Protestants have left. So you can't just say there's unity because you're still here. Like, we split off. And it's like saying, baseball players in a field, and two of them say, we don't want to listen to the ref anymore. And they stand off and they point their fingers at the team saying, hey, look, you guys don't have unity because we left. Like, that's just not how it works. But
right.
Another thing that comes to mind is the passage in Matthew's gospel, I can't remember what chapter, where it talks about when there's an issue between you and your brother, try to resolve it. If it doesn't work, bring some more witnesses, and if not, bring it to the church. That's exactly what happens in Acts 15 around circumcision. It becomes a serious problem, and so they bring it to the church, and the church settles it. This is in Scripture.
It's just very logical. It's like, okay, resolve it between you and your brother, and then ultimately, but you step over those, and then you get into the issue, into the situation of the church. It's the same process. Like, you bring it to your priest. If it's not resolved with your priest, then you bring it to the bishop. And if your bishop doesn't resolve it, then it's the archbishop. And then finally, if it's a divisive enough matter that really is causing systemic issues in the church, the Pope, in communion with the bishops in communion with the Pope, can speak authoritatively, infallibly on that matter, and it's settled.
Yeah. There's a lot here that we could get into. I'm thinking of so many different passages in Scripture. Let's see if we can wrap this up. So,
sure.
Good stuff to talk about. So, give us a bird's-eye view. If you had to summarize this journey, this process that you went through, how would you put it in a pithy, not to put too much pressure on you, in a condensed set of a few phrases? How would you describe your journey?
I had a really narrow understanding of the Bible and of Christianity, and I met skeptics who pointed that out and exploited a lot of errors in it, and they did so, I would say, faithfully. But instead of fully rejecting all of Christianity, I began to have a much more expansive view of it, and because of that, I was able to embrace an authoritative tradition that was handed down by the apostles, and that really began to provide a lot of clarity to a lot of the questions that I had. I think that's
well said.
Roughly what I would say, but I think the issue of between Protestants and Catholics comes down to the issue of authoritative tradition, because everyone has an interpretive tradition. Everyone has a way of understanding the Bible, and so for myself, the reason I became Catholic was because it was through accepting the interpretive tradition of the church that I began to see the commensurate view of Christianity at its best, at its finest.
Yeah. Great. That's awesome. Yeah, and we really like on this podcast just looking at the development of thinking. This is why Newman is such
the development of doctrine.
Exactly, right? But not just theological doctrine, but philosophical doctrine. What did people think, and where has it led? And if you can see the big picture, then you can make sense of the stuff around you, and then you can make informed decisions. And this is what I like about your story, is that you did that. You took a look around and made an informed decision instead of just, jumping the gun, you might say. And I think that's a hopeful...
There was some grace involved.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, I'm pretty objective otherwise.
And that's why I think this story of yours is helpful and hopeful, because some people are at that doubting point and they're listening to Sam Harris, who, has some good stuff, but they... Go ahead.
Could I just say one thing about those guys?
Yeah.
The names that I listed were Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, Yuval Noah Harari, and Chris Anderson.
Yeah.
People who become militant atheists in those situations because they read those people, it's really because they're making good arguments. Like, I genuinely like listening to Sam Harris because his view of Christianity is a view of Christianity that is narrow, and that if I probably wouldn't be a Christian either, because it's deplorable.
Yeah.
Like, if you believe that God creates, human beings to just damn for eternity, well, you believe in a pretty awful God. And just because they point that out as atheists doesn't make them wrong. And so give them their credit. They were able to identify something that was wrong and willing to stand on it.
Absolutely. And I love his conversation with Jordan Peterson. And that's the thing, is that I really see Jordan Peterson as a stepping stool, you might say. That sounds kind of demeaning. As a link in the chain, you might say, that kind of takes us out of this nihilistic naturalism, you might say. And so, but he's also very modern. Like, he's no Aristotelian or anything like that. So that's why I think he's so important for today's culture. But here we are rambling again. So let's try to bring this to a close. So first of all, thank you for coming on the show, and what a fascinating story. And I really hope that we can do some more of these episodes and talk about a more specific topic, But
definitely.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us on the Logos Project. We'll say goodbye then.
All right, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right then. Bye now. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Don't forget to leave us a review. If you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/thelogosproject. LOGOS project. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week.